Okay. All right, friends. So to begin our roundtable discussion today, I want to begin with this question here, since it's very apropos. And it goes as follows. This month of Adar is known as the month of happiness. Can you please tell us, Rabbi, how does one find happiness? Okay, so indeed, this month is the month of happiness. The Talmud famously says that Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha. Today is the second day of Rosh Chodesh, the first day of Adar. And when Adar comes in, as the Talmud says, that we have to increase in happiness. Maybe the climax of this happiness is during the festival of Purim, in which the Megillah that tells the story of Purim tells us that that the Jews, after the festival and the miracle of Purim, they were blessed with light and happiness, simcha. Now, by the way, just as a side note, festival of Purim this year is in the second month of Adar. This year is a leap year. We have 2 months of Adar. So Purim will be celebrated not in 2 weeks from today, but rather in a month and a half from today. That's just as a side note, and we can talk about the leap year afterwards. But I want to get to the crux of the question here, and that is, how does one find happiness? So it's a good question. Maybe it's one of the most fundamental questions of life. I know that in the Constitution, we have that phrase that says that there is a pursuit of happiness that is endowed by a creator, right? And everyone is free to pursue happiness. But there I begin by saying that the pursuit of happiness sometimes is what thwarts happiness. When we think that happiness is somewhere out there and I have to reach that place or that status or that thing that I think makes me happy, then that in and of itself will thwart your happiness. Why? Because the first and fundamental thought of Judaism about happiness is that happiness starts from within. Happiness, as my dear Rabbi Allouche would often say, is synonymous to self-fulfillment. If one can fulfill his purpose in life, if one can actualize the mission of his or her soul, then one will be happy. Happiness, therefore, is a byproduct of self-fulfillment. Why? Because happiness comes from within that soul, from within that actualization of the soul. And that's really formula number one. I want to add 2 more formulas, but just to dwell on this, I'm really reminded of I think it's a story I've shared before, but of one of the best pieces of advice that Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab received in his life, as he himself puts it. It was by the Lubavitch Rebbe, and he was in the 70s. And Dr. Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab is a famed scholar. At the same time, he's a psychologist himself. And he once had many self-doubts that he was struggling with and many questions on faith altogether. And he decided in the 70s then to call the office of the late Lubavitch Rebbe and ask him all of his questions. And the secretary picked up the phone, and the secretary says to this man, "Yes, hello, who's speaking?" And he don't want to say his name. So he said, a Jew from Maryland is calling the Rebbe to ask him about questions on faith and self-doubts. So the secretary says, well, you called at a good time. The Rebbe is right here in the room. Let me see if he can speak with you. Secretary turns to the Rebbe, and he says to the Rebbe, there's a Jew from Maryland here who wants to speak to you about questions of faith. The Rebbe says to the secretary, well, if he's from Maryland, you should go and see this man named Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab to ask him his questions. Now, it was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab calling. But the secretary conveys the message and says, well, the Rebbe says you should go see Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab. So Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab had no choice but to reveal his identity. And he told the secretary, well, this is Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab. Secretary was taken aback, and he turns back to the Rebbe and says, Rebbe, this is Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab speaking. The Rebbe, instead of picking up the phone and answering his questions, he tells the secretary to tell Rabbi Weinrab that, well, if this is Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab speaking, then please tell Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab that from time to time it's good to speak to yourself. And Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinrab, I heard the story directly from him firsthand, and he told me this was one of the best pieces of advice he's ever received in life. Why? Because sometimes we think that we have doubts, we have questions, and life indeed shatters us in many ways, especially its many challenges. But instead of looking outward for some question from the outside and some answer from the outside, sometimes it's good to speak to yourself, because very often when we speak to ourselves, we'll find that we have the answers right here, that we were charged with a mission that God is waiting for us to fulfill. And if we can really fulfill that deepest calling of the soul, each in our own way, of course, everyone here is for a different mission, then we'll find happiness. Then happiness will be fulfilled. That's really, I think, one of the great thoughts of Judaism about happiness. And we can continue to develop this idea. But I do want to speak about two additional formulas that Judaism touches upon. The second one is that also happiness is not just engendered by fulfilling ourselves and our calling, so to speak, but also it is engendered by giving. The more self-preoccupied we are, the less happy we'll be. The more other preoccupied we are, the more happy we will be. Because in many ways, happiness comes from giving. And that's why in Hebrew, and I wrote about this past weekend, in Hebrew, there are two words for happiness, osher and simcha. Maybe in English, we find those same two words, joy and happiness. But the difference between the two is that osher or joy is happiness that we feel. Simcha is happiness that we create, that we do. What's the difference? Osher is happiness that we feel. So when we receive good news, for example, when someone tells me, hey, you won the lottery, I'll feel happy. But usually that happiness doesn't last a long time. Simcha, on the other hand, does not depend on outside circumstances. It depends on me taking the driver's seat and going to do a good deed. When I visit the sick, for example, I become happy. How? Because I just did a good deed that rejoices my soul. My soul wants to do good and now does good. Oh, it feels happy. But that's entirely under my control. It doesn't depend on outside circumstances. It only depends on me, on my inside, on my willingness to go and do good, my willingness to go and visit the sick, on my willingness to go and give charity, on my willingness to do any other mitzvah that there is. And the more we can do and give, the happier, therefore, we will be. That's what true simcha is about. That's the difference between, again, simcha and osher. I'm reminded again of yet another story, if you'll allow me, about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, maybe a story also that we've shared in the past. But there was a man who passed away not too long ago in Los Angeles. His name was Meshulam Weiss. And just before him and his wife got married, they too went to receive a blessing from the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Ashnissen in New York. And during the private audience, his wife-to-be tells Meshulam, hey, I need you to leave the room. I need to speak to the Rebbe privately. Fine. He's shocked, but he leaves the room. After about 20 minutes, he's called back into the room. And then the Rebbe blesses them. And a few days later, they have their wedding. And a few days after that, Meshulam turns to his wife and says to her, hey, why did you kick me out of the room? We were there with the Rebbe, and all of a sudden you asked me to leave. And his wife tells him, look, I'll be honest with you. I kicked you out of the room because I wanted to cancel our wedding. Why? And she says to him, well, that's because of a very bad temper. So I told the Rebbe, maybe I should cancel my wedding. My bad temper is going to destroy my marriage. And the Rebbe smiled, she says. And he said to me, look, if you have bad temper, you don't have to worry because you're going to have many children. And children will teach you patience. You'll be able to overcome your temper. And until you have children, then go and visit the sick. And by visiting the sick and doing good, you'll also be able to overcome the demons within. Now, fast forward many, many, many years, the Weisses, Meshulam and his wife, now have 17 children. 17 children. After menopause, she goes to a doctor and for a checkup, and this doctor was new. He had never seen her before, but he realizes that she's religious. And he tells Mrs. Weiss, wow, you must be so sad because I see here in the ultrasound that we did that you couldn't have children. You have an infertile womb. And I know that religious women like to have children, so you must be very sad. Now, she didn't tell him that she had 17 children, but she went home and she had a good laugh with the husband. And her husband says, you see, this was the brilliance of the Rebbe. By giving you his advice, that children will teach you patience. Not only did he give you brilliant psychological advice, but he also gave you a blessing. Blessing that you'll have children, that you'll be able to overcome your infantile womb. And it's a story just I think of, because really very often we try and fight the bad within, while sometimes, as one of the great Hasidic masters said, a little bit of light expels a lot of darkness. Just do good, ignite some light in this world. Go and bring light to someone else, illuminate a person's life, heal a broken heart, lift a shattered spirit. And then you'll see that light will expel also your own darkness. So happiness also comes through giving. And formula number 3, then we'll get to the other questions. Formula number 3, I think also is maybe a faith-based formula. And that is that we have to recognize, as the Talmud famously says, that everything that happens to us is for the good. Or in the words of Rabbi Akiva, Kol man da'avid rachmana letav avid. Whatever God does is for the good. Rabbi Akiva, by the way, is a person who suffered tremendously in his life, yet he knew how to find good even in the worst of circumstances. Why? Because we have to recognize that sometimes we don't see the whole picture. Our vision as human beings, no matter how wise we are, no matter how experienced we are, is still very narrow. There's a bigger picture that the artist himself is drawing, and some sides of that picture we can't see. And that artist is God. And we just saw this, by the way, a few portions ago with Moses and the Jewish people. The Jewish people cried out to God. They were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, 210 years altogether. And they're crying out to God and said, we can't take this anymore. Now, if I was a slave in Egypt crying out to God, I wouldn't see the results immediately. And I would say to myself, God abandoned me. He's not listening to me. And a day goes by, and a week goes by, and a month goes by, and the situation is still the same. He's not listening to me. But I would have no way of knowing that after I cried out to God, God listened to my prayer. How? Miles and miles away, hundreds of miles away, he reveals himself at that same time when I cried out. He reveals himself to Moses in the burning bush and says to Moses, I have heard their cry. Go and redeem the Jewish people. Now again, as a slave with my narrow vision in Egypt, I would never been able to know that God is working on my redemption. I would have faced yet another day, another month, another year of suffering. I would have said, God abandoned me. But God has already prepared my redemption thanks to my prayer. But what can we do? As human beings, we don't have that pilot view of God's world, of the way he handles our lives. And sometimes happiness comes from this idea that Kol man da'avid rachmana letav avid. Whatever God does is for the good. I know that God is listening. I know that God is broiling my redemption somewhere, somehow. I don't see it, but I have faith that the chief conductor of the symphony will find a way to ensure that my note is not forgotten. And that's also, I think that also engenders happiness. Maybe this is why the word for Jew in Hebrew is the same word as the word for thank you. Yehudi comes from the word todah. It's the same root word, hoda'ah, which means thank you. Because as Jews, we are asked to recognize that God's blessings are everywhere, even in the hell that we may be experiencing. That's why maybe another Hebrew word that I adore is the word for tunnel. You know, in English, we often say that, well, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. The problem with that expression is that it doesn't satisfy me. If I'm in the tunnel experiencing tremendous darkness, I don't care that there's light at the end of the tunnel. What am I doing today? Don't talk to me about 2 months from now when I reach the end of the tunnel. How am I going to overcome my hardships today? And that's why the word for tunnel in Hebrew is the word minhara. Minhara, by the way, does not just mean tunnel. It comes from the word nahor, light. Why? Because Judaism teaches that not only is there light at the end of the tunnel, but there's light in the tunnel itself. And we have to be a Yehudi. We have to be grateful for God's blessings that are enveloping us even today, and believe again that everything that God does is for the good. And somewhere, somehow, he's preparing my redemption and empowering me with all the strength and the tools that I need to overcome the challenge that I may be facing right now. So those are the three formulas. Again, happiness equals self-fulfillment, happiness is giving, and happiness is the faith that all that God does is for the good. That's how one can find happiness, or at least it's a good beginning. I'm just reading the chat here. So there are lessons to learn from even what is perceived as bad. That's right. Sometimes what is perceived as bad is good. We just don't know it at that moment. In hindsight, we often do. So it's well put. Okay, that's happiness. Let's go to question number 2. And then again, we can revisit this topic at the end, and feel free to ask your questions either via chat or by unmuting yourself at the end of the class. Question number 2, good versus bad. Can a person be all good or all bad? Is everyone a combination of the two? So that's a good question. Can a person be all good or all bad? So let's go to the very root of it. The very root of it is that God created us inherently good. But at the same time also implanted in us what we call a yetzer hara, an evil inclination, or what the Tanya calls the animal soul, which is really the soul that causes us to want to act animalistically, like animals. How do animals act? Impulsively. That's what they all have in common. They have no ability to control themselves. So there is a fight within us, really, between the inherent goodness that we have and the bad that becomes also a part of us, that is part of our inclination. And it's a war that we have to face each and every day. I don't think, maybe very, very, very few other people who are able to overcome their bad and put it to rest once and for all. Those are the complete righteous, maybe. That the bad doesn't even speak to them anymore, and that they've eradicated it altogether from their being. Most of us, we face this war between the good and the bad in us each and every day. And sometimes we face them in big battles, sometimes in small battles. It begins, I think, when we wake up in the morning. The good tells us, hey, wake up. You have a purpose to fulfill. The bad inclination, or the animal soul, says, no, just go back to sleep. Hit the snooze button. Catch another hour of sleep or 10 minutes of sleep. And then you think you caught 10 minutes of sleep, but you wake up, of course, 3 hours later. And then you say to yourself, gosh, I just wasted my morning. But still, there's a small battle happening then when we wake up in the morning. And there's a small battle happening when someone annoys us. Are we going to fight back? Are we going to insult? Are we going to humiliate? Are we going to embarrass? Are we going to slander? That's also a small battle, yet an important one. So this war between evil and good exists every moment of the day, almost, right? Hundreds of times a day, I would venture to say. And the more, but the trick is this: the more we allow the good to overcome the bad, the easier it becomes, and vice versa. The more we allow the bad to become the good, the more dominant the bad becomes. Now, there are people that are completely evil. Why? Because they've allowed their bad to win each and every time for many, many months and years, to the point that the good has no say in them anymore. The good inclination doesn't even want to open its mouth anymore. It's never been given a chance to open its mouth. And that's when a person really can be entirely overcome by bad. Is there hope for a person like that? Maybe sometimes. Surely when something devastating happens in life, there's an awakening for every person, and maybe that's when these people wake up. But again, the goal is to be able to win those small battles each and every day, because that's where the real becoming of a person occurs. That's how we define ourselves, and that's how we end up being. We end up being based on our victories or not of those small battles of life. So that's really, that's the root of it. And I'll add just one layer, and that is that I bemoan the fact, I really do, that in our generation, especially in education, we find, and you'll walk into any public school classroom and you'll hear this all the time. We'll find that bad is spoken about. Yes, we have to fight the bad. But you know what the problem is? A bad exists on the outside in these classrooms. We have to fight racism and sexism and bigotry. It's on the outside, and that's fine. Yes, we do have to fight that bad. But no one speaks of the bad that we have to fight inside. How about the evil inclination I have? How about the 10 commandments before social justice? How about that? If we could control ourselves, there would be no need for policemen in the world. The world would be good. But everyone's talking about fighting the bad outside. My beloved Rabbi Steinsaltz told me when I was 16 years old, I'll never forget. He called me aside and he said to me, do you know who the worst enemy is that you have? Who's your worst enemy? I don't know. He said, I'll tell you your worst enemy is. Your worst enemy is you, Penny. My worst enemy, he says, is me, Adin. And I want you to know, once you'll know how to control yourself, then you'll be able to master the world. But if you don't know how to master yourself, you'll never know how to master the world. No one speaks of that these days. Now, thank God, we're working on a legislation here with Alma Hernandez, and even Governor Ducey is involved, and all sides of the aisle are involved here in Arizona to pass the moment of silence legislation in which public school children will have to begin their day with a moment of silence. We can't evoke God because there's a clear separation between church and state in this country, but they'll be able to think about God and think about themselves, think about what they need to rectify in themselves. And hopefully it will pass really soon. And maybe that will be a good step towards the conquering of the bad within before the conquering of the bad without, or maybe at least at the same time as the conquering of the bad without. And that will be a great, I think, change, fundamental shift in society that we can be creating. But that's really where it begins. So that's the answer to that question. Next question. How many Torahs does CBT have? And the history of each one would be an interesting topic. CBT, Congregation Bet Tefillah. Do we now? The question continues and it says, do we use the same Torah for a specific amount of time? And what is the deciding factor on which Torah do we read on a Shabbat? So that's a good question. So CBT, I think, has 10 Torahs. Every Torah is unique. We have a Torah from Saddam Hussein's palace that was rescued in 2002 by the US Army, who then found that Saddam Hussein had confiscated so many antiquities from the Jewish community, including many, many, many Torahs. And these Torahs were shipped to Israel. They were checked by a scribe. Many of them were not kosher. Many of them couldn't be fixed, but some could. Those who were fixed and those who were kosher were then auctioned off. And we had a member here who bought one of those Torahs and donated it to our congregation. So we do have a Torah from Saddam Hussein's palace. We have another Torah from Iran that Vicky, many of you know Victoria Conrad. Her father, a few years ago, went back to Iran, to Tehran, to smuggle his family Torah out of the country. If caught, he would have faced a life sentence in prison, which, by the way, of course, is filled with torture in Iran. So he bribed a whole bunch of people. And as he was at the airport with that Torah in the bag, he also bribed the main electrician of the airport to switch off the power as his bag was going through security. No, I'm not joking. And he was able to smuggle out of the country with great miracles. So we have that Torah. We have a Torah from Morocco that dates back to 300 years. We have all sorts of very interesting Torahs, and we have newer Torahs. The newest was donated about a month ago. But all sorts of Torah, some written on cow skin, some written on deer skin, some written on goat skin. Depends on what kosher animal was found at the time. So the one from Iraq is about 400 years old. The most common animal then was deer, and therefore they use deer skin instead of the cow skin that is more common these days. The only halakhic requirement is that the Torahs be written on a parchment from a kosher animal. So again, you have goats, you have deers, you have cows, and so on. Now, going to this important question of how do we decide which Torah to take out? So we have 10 Torahs. Out of the 10, how do I know which one to take out every Shabbat or every Monday and Thursday when we read the Torah too? for our morning minyan. And the only really guiding principle in Jewish law is that if there's a new Torah, that needs to be taken out as much as possible during that first year to give it respect, especially that if we don't take it out, then we may be conveying a message that, the Torah was donated, but it's no good. That's what we're not using it. Everyone likes using new stuff, right? If you have a new watch, you want to wear it. If you have a new shirt, you want to wear it. So how come I'm not using a new Torah? Oh, maybe there's something wrong. So in order not to convey this message, we are asked to read from that new Torah, at least for the first year, as much as possible. That's really the only requirement. Other than that, I will quote what the Zohar says, and that is "Hakol talui b'mazal, afilu sefer Torah shebaychal," that everything is dependent on luck, even a Torah in the ark. Who's going to use this Torah? Who's going to use that Torah? When are we going to use this Torah? When are we going to use that? That's dependent on luck. It's just a matter of luck. So sometimes, I don't know, my inclination, my intuition tells me, hey, go for the Torah on the left. I picked it. Maybe it's God's luck for that Torah. But other than the principle mentioned about new Torahs, there's really no other guiding principle. Now, obviously, there are times of the week, Shabbats of the week, in which multiple Torahs are taken out. And then more Torahs can be satisfied, so to speak, because we have to use multiple. But otherwise, there's no real principle to that.
Rabbi, I just want to say that a few years ago, I think we were still in the old shul. There was an incident that I did not know, but you were reading Torah and there was something you could not read. And you got one of your boys to come up and can you tell the story?
Right, yeah. So
I
yeah,
didn't know
that happens. That happens thankfully rarely, it's not too common. But of course, every letter in the Torah has to be intact and wholesome. And if a letter is damaged, then the whole Torah is no good. Just like the Jewish people. If one of us is not included, if one of us is not attended to, if one of us is damaged, we can cause this massive reaction upon the entire nation. That's true for the world altogether. The world is not in complete harmony if one person is not playing his role. It's like a play. If one person is not playing his role, then the whole play is damaged. But that's the message behind it. So yes, it happened a few years ago that I was reading from the Torah, and then there was one letter that was a resh, but it looked like a vav. The top of the resh was a little erased. So in cases of doubts, which is one of Judaism's most beautiful and moving ideas, in cases of doubts, you turn to children. Why? Because children have no personal agendas. They're very innocent. And when they see a letter, they'll tell you the truth. They speak innocently, they speak truthfully. There's no confusion and agendas by children. So we called a child to tell us whether this was a resh or a vav in his mind, in his eyesight. And I think he said it was a resh, so we kept reading. I think, may or maybe not. I don't remember what ended up happening. But that was that incident, yeah.
By the way, Rabbi, it was the wrong letter because remember you had to take out another Torah because
so maybe he said it was a vav.
You said it was pasul.
Right. So then, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one last question, and then we can open this up. But this is a question that relates to this year, this specific year, especially in the state of Israel. And that is, maybe you can talk about the Shemitah year, the Shabbat of the land. So this year indeed is the Shemitah year in Israel. The Shemitah year occurs once every 7 years in the land of Israel, because we are commanded by God in the Torah that once every 7 years, the land of Israel should rest. It is my land, God says, and just as I rest every 7th day, so too every 7 years I should rest my land. 7 is a number of completion, and it's therefore the completion of the cycle. Before we go to the next cycle, then the land has to rest. What does that mean, practically speaking? practically speaking, it means that farmers cannot touch, and I'm being almost, accurate here. Touch, of course, they're allowed to touch, but they're not allowed to work the land whatsoever. Not plant seeds in it, not harvest, to produce, nothing. Why? Because the land has to rest. And the land of Israel is called holy during this period of time. Now, and not only that, but also the land of Israel during that time really doesn't belong to anyone. The farmers have to relinquish the ownership, so to speak, of their land, because every 7 years the land belongs to God. God wants it to rest. It's God's land. Every 7 years, God takes over the land, and therefore it doesn't belong to anyone. And therefore, practically speaking, anyone and everyone can walk into a field and pick the apples of those trees from the field and eat them right there and then, because the fields don't belong to anyone. My parents, for example, have a backyard. They live in Jerusalem. They have a backyard with a fig tree, with a little vineyard, with a pomegranate tree, and neighbors come in and out during the Shemitah year to help themselves and pick some figs and grapes. And why? Because the land doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs only to God. It's what's called the hefker. Now, the beautiful idea stems from this reminder that we find very strongly in the Talmud, and that is that at the end of the day, we, and especially the farmers who deal with their own toil, right, with their own sweat, blood, and tears, as Winston Churchill put it, they have to remind themselves that they have a partner in their work. That partner is God. And as much as they think they produced that tree and they nurtured it and they watered it and they made those fruits grow, it was also thanks to God. So once every 7 years, they stop to appreciate their partner and to enable him to come into the picture and say, you know what? We thank you, God. This is also your result, not just our result. So come in, do whatever you want. This is your land too. We're relinquishing our ownership for just 1 year. For 6 years, we had it. Now it's your turn. You're our partner. You have it. And by giving it over to God, we're also expressing our deepest gratitude to God. And by the way, it's a reminder for every one of us, whether we're farmers or not, that whatever business we may be involved with, whatever venture we may be involved with, we have a silent partner. That's God. And from time to time, we have to turn to him and say, thank you, God. Without you, this couldn't have been possible. And that's really the idea of the Shemitah year. Now, to go into maybe one more practical aspect of the Shemitah year, and that is that because the land is holy, as mentioned, every 7 years, so if you are benefiting from this land, of course, for free. So I'm not allowed to sell fruits from this land because it doesn't belong to me. Just like I'm not allowed to go into your apartment right there or home and take a chair and sell it. It's not mine. I can't do that. So I can't go into God's land and start selling fruits. It's his. It's not mine. So you may ask, well, how do the Israelis then survive? How do they have fruits and vegetables during this year? So one way is that they import fruits and vegetables from the outside of Israel. Another way is that no one is benefiting from the fruits and vegetables of the land, but still they are being eaten. And what you are buying a tomato in the marketplace, you're not buying the tomato itself because no one's allowed to profit from the tomato, but your money is going towards the truck driver that brought the tomato and the fuel that he used. It's going to the other expenses, but not to the land itself that belongs to God, and therefore no one can profit for it. Now, if you have a tomato like that, it's holy, comes from the land of Israel, which is holy every 7 years. And therefore you have to treat it with holiness. So practically speaking, it means if you have some leftover from the tomato, you can't just throw it in the garbage. It's holy. So on this year, you have to wrap the leftover of the tomato in a separate plastic bag and then put it in the garbage bag, so that there's distinction between that which is holy and that which is not, even in the garbage bin. Or you can just go out and bury that tomato, bring it back to the land so that holiness finds holiness. But again, you got to be able to treat it. Now, we have to be careful even here. I know we don't buy tomatoes from Israel here, But what we do buy is kosher wine from Israel very often. So if you find a kosher wine from 2021, 2022, it might be coming from the land of Israel, which has therefore had needed holy grapes to make that wine. So you either have to finish the entire bottle of wine and can't leave any drop and consume it all, or if you have some wine left, then again, you have to throw it in a separate garbage bin, or you have to throw it in a separate plastic bag, and then put it in your garbage bin. So to distinct again, that which is holy from that which is not.